3 days after my husband's death, my son said, "The house was sold at a loss. Your share is $7,000. But it was worth $300,000. I smiled and asked, "Who's the buyer?" When he answered, he realized he'd just sold it. To me. Before we continue, please write in the comments which country you're listening from. Enjoy the story. My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 52 years old, and until 3 days ago, I thought I knew my son David better than anyone in this world. I carried him for 9 months, raised him through sleepless nights, scraped together money for his law school tuition when my husband Robert was laid off from the factory. I worked double shifts at the hospital, my hands raw from washing them 100 times a day, my feet swollen in those white nursing shoes that never seemed to fit quite right. For 30 years, I gave everything I had to my family. Every promotion I turned down because Robert needed me when his back gave out. Every weekend, I spent caring for him instead of taking those continuing education courses that might have advanced my career. Every dollar I earned went toward David's future, his dreams, his success. Robert passed away on a Tuesday morning. The cancer finally won the battle we'd been fighting for 2 years. I held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering that I'd take care of everything, just like I always had. The funeral was small but dignified. David stood beside me at the graveside, his arm around my shoulders, telling relatives how strong his mother was, how she'd held the family together through everything. I believed him when he said those words. I thought he meant them. 3 days later, I was sitting in my kitchen, our kitchen, the same one where I'd made thousands of meals, packed countless lunches, bandaged scraped knees and broken hearts. The morning light filtered through the curtains I'd sewn myself 20 years ago, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum floor. This house held every memory of my marriage, every milestone of David's childhood. It was more than walls and windows. It was the foundation of everything I'd built. David knocked on the door before walking in, which should have been my first warning. He never knocked. This was his childhood home. But there he was, standing in the doorway with his wife Nora beside him, both of them dressed in their expensive suits, looking like they were here on business rather than to comfort a grieving mother. "Mom, we need to talk," David said, his voice carrying that professional tone he used with clients. Not the voice of a son speaking to his mother 3 days after burying his father. I gestured to the kitchen table where we'd shared so many meals. "Of course, honey. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." "This isn't a social visit, Mom." Nora spoke before David could answer, her manicured fingers drumming against her designer purse. "We need to discuss your financial situation." My financial situation. As if I were a case study rather than the woman who had raised the man she married. David pulled out a folder thick with documents, legal papers. My heart began to race, but I kept my expression calm. 30 years of nursing had taught me to stay composed in crisis situations, and some instinct told me this was definitely a crisis. "Mom, I know this is difficult timing, but we can't wait," David said, not quite meeting my eyes. "The house needs to be sold. Dad's medical bills, the funeral expenses, the mortgage. You're drowning in debt." I wasn't drowning in anything, but I let him continue. "I've already found a buyer," he said, sliding a contract across the table. "It's not ideal, but given the circumstances, we had to move fast. The market is terrible right now, and this place needs so much work." I looked down at the papers. The sale price made my blood run cold, $47,000 for a house that I knew was worth at least $300,000. Maybe more, given the neighborhood's recent development. "Your share after paying off the debts comes to about $7,000, Nora added, her voice matter-of-fact. "It's not much, but it'll help you get started in a small apartment somewhere. David and I have been looking at some nice senior living communities." Senior living communities. At 52. I stared at my son, this man I'd sacrificed everything for, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter but more dangerous. Recognition. "Who's the buyer?" I asked, my voice steady. David glanced at Nora before answering. A real estate investment company, Thompson Holdings LLC. They specialize in quick sales for families in distress. Thompson Holdings LLC. I smiled then, perhaps the first genuine smile I'd felt since Robert's diagnosis. David must have mistaken it for gratitude because his shoulders relaxed slightly. "That's wonderful, honey," I said, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "You've thought of everything." And he had. Every detail except one. He had no idea who really owned Thompson Holdings LLC. "Let me tell you about the woman I used to be, before I learned that love without boundaries becomes a weapon in the wrong hands. I met Robert Thompson when I was 22, fresh out of nursing school with dreams bigger than my small-town upbringing should have allowed. He was 25, working construction, with hands that could build anything and a smile that made me believe we could build a life together that would last forever. And we did, in a way. 28 years of marriage, through sickness and health, richer and poorer, though we spent far more time in the poorer category than either of us had planned. When David was born, I was working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital. Robert would come home from construction sites covered in dust and concrete, and I'd leave for the hospital smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion. We'd pass each other in the hallway, sharing a quick kiss and a whispered update about our baby boy who was growing up in fragments between our schedules. I loved that job, loved the feeling of making a difference, of using my hands to heal instead of hurt. But when David started school, I realized I was missing everything. Parent-teacher conferences scheduled during my shifts. School plays I'd hear about secondhand. Soccer games where Robert sat alone in the bleachers because I was changing bedpans and monitoring IVs. So I switched to day shift, took a pay cut, and started working weekends to make up the difference. Robert's back problems began when David was 10, a fall from scaffolding that never quite healed right. The workers' compensation barely covered the medical bills, and Robert's pride wouldn't let him admit he couldn't do the physical work anymore. That's when I picked up the extra shifts. Double shifts on weekends, holiday pay that meant spending Christmas morning in the hospital while Robert and David opened presents without me. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was providing stability for my family. I told myself that sacrifice was love in its purest form. When David was accepted to law school, Robert and I sat at this same kitchen table, surrounded by financial aid forms and loan applications. The numbers were staggering. Even with scholarships, we'd need to find $60,000 we didn't have. "Maybe community college first," Robert suggested, his voice careful. "Get the basic courses out of the way, save some money." But I looked at my son, bright, ambitious, determined, and I couldn't let him settle for less than his dreams. That night, I called my supervisor and asked about the nursing positions at the private hospital across town. Better pay, but longer hours, more demanding patients, higher stress, less job security. I took the position and worked there for 8 years, until Robert's condition worsened and he needed constant care. Then I switched back to St. Mary's, part-time, so I could be home during the day. Part-time pay for full-time expenses. We refinanced the house twice to keep David in school. David graduated summa cum laude. I was so proud I cried during his commencement speech about the importance of family support in achieving success. He thanked me publicly, called me his hero, said he couldn't have done it without his parents' sacrifices. After graduation, he got a job at a prestigious firm in the city. Good salary, benefits, a future that looked bright and stable. He moved into a downtown apartment with Nora, whom he'd met in law school. She came from money, old money, the kind that gives you confidence in your posture and polish in your speech. The first time I met Nora, she looked around our house like she was conducting an inspection. Her eyes lingered on the mismatched furniture, the faded wallpaper, the kitchen appliances that had seen better decades. She smiled politely, but I caught her whispering something to David about quaint and rustic charm. David started visiting less frequently after they got married. Phone calls became brief updates rather than conversations. When Robert was diagnosed with cancer, David was sympathetic but busy. Court cases, client meetings, career advancement. He'd visit on Sundays sometimes, bringing flowers and good intentions, but leaving before the conversation could drift toward anything too heavy or uncomfortable. Nora came with him occasionally, usually checking her phone and making comments about how hospitals had that smell and how difficult it must be to live this way. She never offered to help with Robert's care, never asked if I needed anything beyond their thoughts and prayers. During Robert's final months, when the chemotherapy was failing and the pain medication barely took the edge off, I took family leave from work. Unpaid leave, because we'd already used up all our paid time off. David offered to help with the medical expenses, but when the bills started arriving, thousands of dollars for treatments that only bought us a few extra weeks, his contributions became smaller and less frequent. "I wish we could do more," he'd say, glancing at Nora, who would nod sympathetically while calculating the cost of her monthly manicures. I didn't blame them. Not then. I understood that they had their own life to build, their own financial responsibilities. I was the mother. This was my job. Taking care of people was what I'd always done, what I was good at, what gave my life meaning and purpose. But sometimes, lying awake at night listening to Robert's labored breathing, I wondered when I'd stopped being a person and become just a function: wife, mother, caregiver. When had my identity become entirely defined by what I could do for other people? 3 days after Robert's funeral, sitting in my kitchen with legal documents spread across the table, I finally understood the answer to that question. I had never stopped being a person. They had simply stopped seeing me as one. The signs were always there. I just chose to interpret them as love instead of entitlement. It started small, the way these things always do. David would call, not to ask how I was doing, but to complain about his student loan payments. "It's just so unfair, Mom. I'm working 60-hour weeks and still barely making ends meet." This from a man earning more in a month than I made in 6, living in a downtown apartment that cost more in rent than my entire annual salary at the hospital. "Maybe you could move somewhere less expensive?" I suggested once. "Nora can't live just anywhere," he replied, as if I'd suggested they move into a cardboard box. "Her career has certain expectations. Image matters in her field." Nora worked in marketing for a luxury goods company. Her job, as far as I could tell, involved attending networking events and posting carefully curated photos on social media. But it required the right address, the right clothes, the right everything. And somehow, their need for the right everything became my responsibility to understand and accommodate. When they got married, the wedding cost $40,000. I know because David told me multiple times, usually when he was explaining why they couldn't contribute more to Robert's medical expenses. The reception was at a country club I'd only seen from the outside, with flowers that cost more than my car, and a photographer whose fee could have paid for 3 months of Robert's medication. I wasn't invited to any of the planning meetings. Nora had people for that, wedding planners and florists and caterers who spoke in languages I didn't understand. My role was to show up, smile, and write a check for whatever they needed me to cover. $5,000 for flowers that would die within a week. $2,000 for a videographer to capture memories I wasn't consulted about creating. "It's what every bride dreams of," David explained, when I gently suggested that maybe $40,000 was excessive for one day. "You want Nora to be happy, don't you, Mom?" Of course I did. But I also wanted to keep the electricity turned on and buy Robert's prescriptions without having to choose between them and groceries. Those were details David didn't need to worry about. I was the mother. Managing impossible budgets was just another skill in my caregiving toolkit. After the wedding, the requests became more frequent and more casual. David would call on Sunday afternoons, chatting about work and weather before getting to the real reason for his call. "Hey, Mom, could you help us out with the security deposit for the new apartment? It's just that all our wedding money went to the honeymoon, and this place is perfect for Nora's career." Or, "Mom, Nora's car broke down, and the repair is going to be $3,000. Could you float us a loan? We'll pay you back as soon as my bonus comes in." The bonus never came, or when it did, there was always something else that needed it more urgently. A vacation to help them recover from work stress. A new furniture set because their apartment deserved pieces with character. A weekend getaway for Nora's birthday because she'd been so supportive of David's career. I said yes to all of it. Every request, every emergency, every urgent need that somehow became my problem to solve. I took extra shifts when my back was screaming in protest. I delayed my own doctor's appointments because the co-pays added up. I wore scrubs until they were threadbare and shoes until the soles were held together with medical tape. When Robert's health declined, the requests didn't stop. They evolved. "Mom, I know Dad's situation is stressful, but could you not mention the medical bills when we visit? It's just that Nora gets anxious about illness, and we both work so hard during the week. Sundays are our only time to relax." So I stopped mentioning the bills. I stopped mentioning how tired I was, how scared I was, how sometimes I sat in hospital waiting rooms crying into my hands because I didn't know how we were going to pay for the treatments that weren't working anyway. When David visited, I made sure the house looked cheerful. I hid the pill bottles and medical equipment. I prepared his favorite meals even when Robert couldn't keep food down and I was too exhausted to eat. I created an environment where David and Nora could feel comfortable, even if it meant pretending our reality wasn't falling apart. "You're so strong, Mom," David would say as they were leaving. "I don't know how you do it." But he never offered to help me find out. He never asked if I wanted to be that strong, or if I had any choice in the matter. The real revelation came 6 months before Robert died. David called on a Thursday evening, which was unusual. Thursday was his networking night at the Bar Association. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." My heart stopped. Robert had been having a particularly bad week, and I thought maybe David had heard something from the doctors. "What is it, honey? Are you going to be okay financially when Dad, when it's just you? Because Nora and I have been talking, and we think you should start planning for your future. Maybe think about downsizing or looking into those assisted living places. I mean, you can't take care of that big house by yourself, and the expenses." He kept talking, but I stopped listening after assisted living places. My son, whom I had raised and sacrificed for and supported through every challenge of his life, was planning my institutionalization while his father was still breathing. "I'm only 52, David," I said when he finally paused. "I know, but you've been through so much. The stress of caregiving ages people, Mom. We just want you to be realistic about your limitations." My limitations. Not my capabilities, not my strength, not the fact that I'd been managing impossible situations for 30 years. My limitations. That night, after Robert had fallen asleep, I sat in the kitchen and looked around at the house David was so eager to see me leave. The house where I'd raised him, where every room held memories of his childhood, where he'd learned to walk and talk and dream about becoming a lawyer. And I realized that to him, it had become nothing more than an asset to be liquidated when convenient, just like me. The morning after David and Nora left with their signed contracts, I sat in my bedroom staring at Robert's empty side of the bed. The indentation from his body was still there in the mattress, a ghost of 30 years of shared sleep. I pressed my hand into that hollow space and tried to imagine what he would say about our son's betrayal. Robert had always seen the best in David. "He's ambitious," he'd say when I worried about our son's increasing demands for money. "That's not a bad thing, Maggie. We raised him to want more than we had." But this wasn't ambition. This was something else entirely. I got dressed slowly, choosing my clothes carefully. Navy blue dress, the one I'd worn to job interviews and parent-teacher conferences. Low heels that didn't hurt my feet. Pearl earrings Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary. I wanted to look like the woman I used to be, competent, professional, someone who deserved respect. The drive to David's law firm took 40 minutes through morning traffic. I'd only been there once before for a tour when he first got the job. The building was all glass and steel, designed to intimidate rather than welcome. The lobby had marble floors that clicked under my heels and a receptionist who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. "I'm here to see David Thompson," I told her. She glanced at her computer screen with the expression of someone doing me a favor. "Do you have an appointment?" "I'm his mother." Something shifted in her demeanor, though I couldn't tell if it was sympathy or pity. "Let me call his office." 5 minutes later, David appeared in the lobby looking surprised and slightly annoyed. He was wearing a suit that cost more than I made in a month, his hair perfectly styled, his shoes polished to mirror brightness. He looked successful. He looked like everything I'd sacrificed to help him become. "Mom, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" "I need to talk to you. About the house." He glanced around the lobby, clearly uncomfortable. "This isn't really the best place." "Then let's go to your office." His office was on the 15th floor, with windows overlooking the city and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. There were photos on his desk, his wedding day, a vacation with Nora, his law school graduation. No pictures of me or Robert. "Mom, if this is about the sale price, I explained yesterday that the market is terrible right now. Houses in your neighborhood aren't moving, and with all the repairs needed." "What repairs?" He sat behind his desk, putting the large wooden surface between us like a barrier. "Well, the roof needs work. The plumbing is old. The electrical system isn't up to current code. The buyers are taking a significant risk, which is why they can only offer what they did." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Have you seen the inspection report?" "Of course." He shuffled through some papers, not meeting my eyes. "It's all documented." "May I see it?" For the first time since I'd arrived, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Mom, these are complex legal documents, technical terminology. You don't need to worry about the details." "I'd like to see the inspection report, David." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating. How much could he show me without revealing the truth? How much did I actually understand about real estate transactions? "The important thing is that we're solving your financial problems," he said instead. $7,000 isn't much, but it's enough to get you started somewhere smaller, somewhere more manageable. More manageable for whom? The question hung in the air between us. David's jaw tightened slightly, the way it used to when he was a teenager and I'd caught him in a lie. "For you, Mom. You can't maintain a house that size by yourself. You don't have the income or the physical ability. Since when do you know what I can and can't do? Since I watched you struggle for the past 2 years trying to keep up with Dad's medical expenses and the house payments and everything else." His voice took on that patronizing tone I was beginning to recognize. "I'm trying to help you be realistic about your situation." "My situation." I repeated his words back to him. "What exactly do you think my situation is?" He leaned back in his chair, adopting the posture he probably used with clients he considered not quite bright enough to understand their own legal problems. "Mom, you're a widow with limited income and significant debt. The house is worth more as a teardown than as a residence. The responsible thing is to take what we can get and help you transition to something more appropriate for your stage of life." Stage of life. As if being 52 made me ancient and incapable. "And what about my stage of life requires me to accept $47,000 for a house worth 10 times that amount?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Mom, I don't know where you're getting that number, but Zillow estimates the house at $285,000. The house 3 doors down sold for $320,000 last month. The Jameson place across the street got $340,000 in February." I pulled out a small notebook where I'd written down all the comparable sales in the neighborhood. "So where exactly did $47,000 come from?" David stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. His mother wasn't supposed to know about comparable sales or market values. His mother was supposed to trust him and be grateful for whatever crumbs he chose to offer. "Mom, those websites aren't accurate, And every house is different. You're right, I said, closing the notebook. Every house is different. Some have new roofs. Some have updated electrical. Some have been maintained by owners who took pride in their property for 30 years. I stood up, smoothing down my dress. David remained seated behind his desk, looking like a child who'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. I have one more question, I said. He nodded, probably hoping I was finally going to accept his explanation and leave. This buyer, Thompson Holdings LLC, what do you know about them? They're a real estate investment company. They specialize in distressed properties, quick sales for families who need immediate liquidity. Have you met with them personally? I've spoken with their representative. What's their address? Another pause, another calculation behind his eyes. Mom, why does that matter? I'm curious about the company that's buying my house. Is that unreasonable? He shuffled through papers again, pulling out a business card. Here. But Mom, you don't need to contact them directly. I'm handling all the legal aspects. I took the card and read the address. It was a downtown office building, the kind that housed dozens of small businesses and temporary operations. The kind of address you'd use if you needed to establish a business quickly and quietly. Thank you, I said, slipping the card into my purse. This has been very enlightening. As I walked toward the door, David called after me. Mom, I know this is hard, but I'm doing what's best for everyone. You'll understand when you see how much simpler your life becomes. I paused with my hand on the door handle. You know what's interesting, David? What? You keep talking about what's best for me. But you've never once asked me what I want. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like falling. Not the scary kind of falling, but the liberating kind. The kind where you realize you're not afraid of hitting the bottom because you've finally understood that you've been flying all along. I had work to do. That evening, I sat in Robert's old recliner with a cup of tea and a manila folder I hadn't opened in 15 years. The folder was thick with documents that most people keep in safe deposit boxes or filing cabinets, but I'd always kept it close. Old habits from a woman who'd learned early that important papers have a way of disappearing when other people think you don't understand their value. The folder contained my inheritance from my grandmother, Eleanor Whitman. Most people in town remembered Eleanor as the eccentric old lady who lived in the Victorian mansion on Elm Street, surrounded by cats and rumors about hidden money. What they didn't know was that Eleanor Whitman had been one of the sharpest businesswomen in the county, quietly buying up properties during the Depression when desperate families sold their land for pennies on the dollar. When Eleanor died, I was 25 and newly married to Robert. The lawyer who read her seemed as surprised as everyone else that the crazy cat lady had left a substantial estate to her granddaughter, the quiet nurse who visited every Sunday and never asked for anything. Your grandmother has left you quite a portfolio, Mrs. Thompson, he'd said, sliding documents across his desk. 3 commercial properties downtown, a farmhouse with 40 acres outside the city limits, and several investment accounts. The total value is approximately $400,000. $400,000 in 1985, worth more than $1 million today. I'd stared at those papers like they were written in a foreign language. Robert and I were struggling to make ends meet in our little starter home, and suddenly I was wealthy. Not rich enough to quit working or buy a mansion, but wealthy enough to never worry about keeping the lights on or choosing between groceries and gas money. What do you want to do with it? Robert had asked when I brought the papers home. I thought about that question for weeks. We could have paid off our mortgage, bought a bigger house, taken vacations, lived differently. But something about my grandmother's story stayed with me. Eleanor had survived the Depression, lived through wars, watched the world change around her. She'd accumulated wealth not by flashing it around, but by being patient, strategic, invisible. I want to keep it quiet, I finally told Robert. I want to keep working, keep living the way we are. This money is our insurance policy, not our identity. So I set up a trust. Thompson Holdings LLC, named after my married name, but funded by my grandmother's legacy. I used it carefully over the years, covering David's education when Robert couldn't work, paying for Robert's medical treatments when insurance fell short, maintaining our house and our dignity without anyone knowing where the money really came from. Robert knew, of course. He was the only one who knew about the trust, the properties, the investments that had grown quietly in the background of our simple life. He understood why I wanted to keep it secret, especially as David grew older and his relationship with money became complicated. If he knows you have money, he'll never learn to value what he earns himself, Robert had said when David was in high school, already showing signs of entitlement. And if he knows you have money, he'll never understand why you work so hard. Robert was right. David had grown up believing his mother was a working-class nurse who struggled to pay bills and saved every penny for his future. He'd never questioned where the money for his education really came from, or how we'd managed to cover his father's medical expenses, or why the mortgage on our house had been paid off years earlier than anyone expected. He'd assumed it was all sacrifice and struggle, which in many ways it was. But it wasn't the kind of desperate struggle he imagined. It was chosen struggle, the deliberate decision to live below our means, to maintain humility, to teach our son the value of hard work by example. Now, sitting in the quiet house with my grandmother's legacy spread across the coffee table, I realized that my good intentions had created a monster. David didn't see me as a woman who had chosen to live simply. He saw me as a woman who had no choice but to live simply. He didn't see my sacrifices as gifts. He saw them as obligations. He didn't see my resources as mine to manage. He saw them as his to inherit. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. Whitman Properties. This is Gerald. Gerald Morrison had been my grandmother's lawyer and had become mine after she died. He was in his 70s now, but still sharp as a knife when it came to business matters. Gerald, it's Maggie Thompson. Maggie, I was so sorry to hear about Robert. How are you holding up? I'm managing. Actually, that's why I'm calling. I need to ask you about Thompson Holdings, LLC. What about it? The trust is doing well. Your real estate investments have appreciated considerably, especially the downtown properties. The portfolio is worth about $2 million now. $2 million. I let that number settle in my mind. While David was explaining to me that I couldn't afford to maintain my house, I was worth $2 million. Gerald, I need to ask you about something specific. If someone wanted to sell property to Thompson Holdings, how would that work? Well, the trust can purchase real estate like any other investment entity. You just need to approve the transaction as the sole beneficiary. Are you thinking about expanding the portfolio? Something like that. What if someone tried to sell property to Thompson Holdings without knowing I was the owner? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Gerald Morrison had been handling unusual situations for 50 years, but this one seemed to puzzle him. Maggie, what exactly is going on? I took a deep breath and told him about David's visit, the sales contract, the ridiculously low offer, and the name of the buyer. When I finished, Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, he finally said. Your son is trying to sell your house to your own company for $47,000, believing that he's acting as your agent and that you don't know the true value of the property. That's correct. And he has no idea that you own Thompson Holdings. None whatsoever. Another pause. Then Gerald Morrison began to laugh. Not a polite chuckle, but a deep, genuine laugh that spoke of a lifetime spent watching human nature reveal itself in surprising ways. Maggie, this is either the most elaborate misunderstanding I've encountered in 40 years of law practice, or your son is attempting to defraud his own mother out of $250,000. I think we both know which one it is. Indeed. So what do you want to do about it? I looked around the room where I'd raised my son, where I'd cared for my husband, where I'd built a life based on love and sacrifice and the belief that good people deserved good things. I want to buy my house, I said. At his asking price? At his asking price. Gerald chuckled again. This should be interesting. When do you need the paperwork? How soon can you have it ready? Give me 2 days. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life I'd kept secret for 30 years. Tomorrow, David would call to check on the sales process. He'd ask if I was okay, if I needed anything, if I understood how lucky I was that he'd found a buyer so quickly. And I'd tell him yes, I understood perfectly. The next morning, I drove to the office building listed on Thompson Holdings' business card. It was a modest 15-story structure downtown, the kind that housed insurance agencies and small law firms and businesses that needed a professional address but couldn't afford prime real estate. The directory in the lobby showed Thompson Holdings LLC on the 8th floor, Suite 804. I took the elevator up, curious to see what David had created for his phantom buyer. Suite 804 was a virtual office, a single room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a receptionist who worked for multiple companies. She looked up when I entered, her smile professional but impersonal. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for information about Thompson Holdings LLC. I understand they're interested in purchasing property." "Oh yes, Mr. Thompson handles those transactions, but he's not in today. Would you like to leave a message?" Mr. Thompson. David had created an entire fictional persona to facilitate his scheme. "Actually, I think there might be some confusion. I'm Mrs. Thompson, and I believe I'm the owner of Thompson Holdings." The receptionist's smile faltered slightly. She pulled out a folder and flipped through some papers. "I'm sorry, but according to our records, Thompson Holdings LLC is managed by David Thompson. He's the one who rented this office space last month." Last month. While Robert was dying, while I was focused on hospice care and funeral arrangements, David had been setting up a fake company to steal my house. "I see. And what address does Mr. Thompson have on file?" She consulted her papers again. "The same address as the property they're looking to purchase, 247 Maple Street. My address." David had used my own home as the business address for the company he was using to rob me. I thanked the receptionist and left, my mind working through the implications. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a misguided attempt to help me. This was premeditated fraud, planned while his father was on his deathbed. My phone buzzed as I reached the parking garage. A text from David. "Hey Mom, just checking in. How are you feeling about everything? The buyer is eager to close quickly." I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "I'm feeling very enlightened. Thank you for asking." I didn't wait for his response. My next stop was downtown, to the law offices of Morrison & Associates. Gerald Morrison's firm occupied the top floor of one of the city's oldest buildings, with windows that offered a view of the entire downtown area. I could see David's office building from Gerald's conference room. "The paperwork is ready," Gerald said, sliding a thick folder across the mahogany table. "Purchase agreement, funding authorization, all the necessary documents for Thompson Holdings LLC to acquire 247 Maple Street for the agreed-upon price of $47,000. "And the inspection report?" Gerald's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Ah, yes, the inspection report that justifies such a low offer. I took the liberty of having the property actually inspected by a licensed professional." "Would you like to see the real report?" The genuine inspection report was thorough and professional. The house needed some minor maintenance, a few loose shingles, some caulking around windows, routine upkeep that any 30-year-old home would require. Total estimated cost of repairs, less than $3,000. "So much for the major structural problems," I said. "Indeed. I also ran a comparative market analysis. Based on recent sales in your neighborhood, the fair market value of your property is approximately $315,000. $315,000. David was trying to steal nearly $270,000 from his own mother. "There's something else you should know," Gerald continued. "I did some research into your son's recent financial activities. Professional curiosity, you understand." He pulled out another document. "David and his wife purchased a vacation home in the Hamptons 6 months ago. Cash purchase, $800,000. I stared at the real estate record. While David was telling me about his student loan struggles and asking for help with security deposits, he'd bought an $800,000 vacation home. How? I asked. Nora's trust fund. Apparently she came into her inheritance when she turned 30 last year. Quite substantial, several $1,000,000 from what I can determine. The room felt like it was spinning. David didn't need my money. He didn't need my house. He had access to more wealth than I'd ever dreamed of possessing. Then why? I whispered. Gerald leaned back in his chair, his expression sad. In my experience, people like David don't steal because they need money. They steal because they feel entitled to it. Because they've convinced themselves that their victims don't deserve what they have. I thought about all the times David had looked around my house with barely concealed disdain. All the comments about me living beyond my means, about needing to be realistic about my limitations. He hadn't seen a mother who'd sacrificed for her family. He'd seen a foolish old woman who had something he wanted. What's our next move? I asked. That depends on what you want to accomplish. Do you want to simply stop the fraud, or do you want him to understand what he's done? I looked out the window at the city where I'd worked for 30 years, where I'd raised my son, where I'd built a life based on the belief that love and sacrifice would be recognized and valued. I want him to understand, I said. I want him to see exactly who he's been dealing with. Gerald smiled, the expression of a lawyer who'd just been handed a particularly satisfying case. Then let's give him what he's asking for. Thompson Holdings LLC will purchase your house for exactly the price he's offered. We'll schedule the closing for next Friday at 3 o'clock. Will David be there? Oh, yes. As your agent, he'll need to be present to sign over the deed and collect your proceeds. And that's when I'll tell him? That's when you'll show him. Sometimes actions speak louder than words. I signed the papers with steady hands. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like myself again. Not the grieving widow, not the struggling single mother, not the woman who needed her son's help to navigate her own life. I was Margaret Thompson, granddaughter of Eleanor Whitman, owner of a $2 million investment portfolio, and David was about to learn that he'd severely underestimated the woman who'd raised him. The closing was set for Friday at 3 o'clock. I couldn't wait. The changes began small, the way revolutions always do. Tuesday morning, David called with his usual update about the sale process. Everything's moving smoothly, Mom. The buyer is very pleased with the property. Should have everything finalized by Friday. That's wonderful, honey, I said, stirring my coffee slowly. I've been thinking about what you said, about me being more realistic about my limitations. I'm glad you're starting to see things clearly. Oh, I'm seeing things very clearly now. In fact, I've decided to make some changes. Changes? I could hear the slight concern in his voice. Changes weren't part of his plan. Well, for starters, I won't be contributing to your student loan payments anymore. There was a pause. Mom, this isn't really the time to make financial decisions. You're grieving, you're stressed. I'm also 52 years old with 30 years of nursing experience. I think I can handle my own financial decisions. But we talked about this. Your income is limited now, and with the house sale will give me $7,000 according to you. That's not enough to support your loan payments and my living expenses. Another pause, longer this time. Mom, those payments are only $300 a month, which is $300 more than I can afford on my limited income. I heard him take a deep breath, the sound of someone trying to control their temper. Look, we can figure this out after the closing. Once you're settled somewhere smaller. I've also been thinking about that vacation home you mentioned. The silence stretched so long I thought the call might have dropped. What vacation home? The one in the Hamptons. $800,000 is quite an investment. How did you? His voice sounded strangled. Gerald Morrison mentioned it. You remember Gerald, don't you? He handled your grandfather's estate years ago. Lovely man. Very thorough in his research. Mom, I don't know what Gerald told you, but he told me about Nora's trust fund. Quite substantial, from what I understand. Makes me wonder why you've been so concerned about my financial limitations when you have access to several $1,000,000. The silence this time was different. Not confusion, but calculation. David was trying to figure out how much I knew and how much damage I could do with the information. That money isn't mine, Mom. It's Nora's family money. We can't just... Of course not. Family money should stay in the family. I completely understand. Wednesday, I called David's office directly. David Thompson's office. This is Jennifer. Hello, Jennifer. This is David's mother. I was wondering if I could schedule a meeting with him for Thursday afternoon. Oh, Mrs. Thompson. Of course. Let me check his calendar. Is 2 o'clock convenient? Actually, I was hoping we could meet somewhere other than his office. Perhaps lunch? My treat. I'll ask him and get back to you. 20 minutes later, Jennifer called back. Mr. Thompson says he's very busy this week with the house closing, but he could meet you for a quick coffee Thursday at noon. Tell him I'll be at Rosario's downtown at noon. If he can't make it, I'll understand. I'll just handle the closing myself. Jennifer called back within 5 minutes. Mr. Thompson will be there at noon. Thursday at noon, I arrived at Rosario's 15 minutes early. I chose a table by the window where I could watch David's approach. I wanted to see his face before he composed it for our conversation. He arrived exactly on time, looking polished and professional in another expensive suit. But I caught the brief moment of uncertainty as he scanned the restaurant, looking for his predictable, manageable mother. I waved him over, smiling brightly. "Mom, you look..." He paused, studying my appearance. I'd dressed carefully, not in my usual modest clothes, but in a tailored blue suit I'd bought years ago for special occasions. My hair was styled, my makeup was perfect, and I was wearing my grandmother's sapphire necklace. "Different," I suggested. "Yes, different." He sat across from me, his movements careful and controlled. "So what did you want to discuss that couldn't wait until after the closing?" I sipped my coffee, taking my time. "I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" "For helping me understand my situation so clearly. You're absolutely right that I need to be more realistic about my limitations." Relief flooded his features. "I'm glad you're finally seeing things that way." "Yes, I've been doing a lot of thinking about what I can and can't do. For instance, I can't continue supporting your lifestyle while you have access to millions of dollars I didn't know about." His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "I can't continue pretending I don't understand real estate values when I've been watching the market in my neighborhood for 30 years. He set down his cup carefully, his lawyer's training kicking in. "Mom, I think there's been some misunderstanding. I can't continue allowing you to treat me like I'm incompetent when I've been managing complex financial decisions since before you were born." "What financial decisions? Mom, you work at a hospital. You live paycheck to paycheck." "Do I?" The question hung between us like a challenge. David's eyes narrowed slightly. The first sign that he was beginning to understand this wasn't the conversation he'd expected. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe your assumptions about your mother's limitations aren't as accurate as you thought. Mom, if you're upset about the house sale, I can explain." "Oh, I understand the house sale perfectly. A real estate investment company called Thompson Holdings is purchasing my property for $47,000. Very straightforward transaction." Something shifted in David's expression. The confident lawyer was being replaced by someone who sensed he was losing control of the narrative. "You seem nervous," I observed. "I'm not nervous. I'm concerned about you. This behavior isn't like you." "What behavior? Asking questions? Wanting to understand my own financial transactions? Expecting honesty from my son?" "You're being paranoid. The stress of losing Dad, the confusion about money." I leaned forward, my voice gentle but firm. "David, I'm not confused. I'm not paranoid. And I'm certainly not incompetent. I'm a woman who's been underestimated, and that's a very different thing." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to reconcile this version of his mother with the one he'd been manipulating for months. "I don't know what Gerald Morrison told you, but..." "Gerald didn't tell me anything I didn't already know. He just confirmed what I'd suspected. Which is? I smiled. The same warm smile I'd given him when he graduated law school, when he got his first job, when I was proud of the man I thought he'd become. That my son is trying to steal my house. The words settled between us like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would change everything that came after. David's face went pale, then flushed red. That's an incredible accusation. Is it? I'm trying to help you. Are you? You can't afford to maintain that house. Says who? You're living in denial about your financial situation. Am I? Each question seemed to strip away another layer of his composure. The confident lawyer was disappearing, replaced by a child caught in a lie he couldn't explain away. Mom, I think you need to see someone. A counselor, maybe. Grief can cause paranoid thoughts. I stood up, leaving a $20 bill on the table. The closing is tomorrow at 3 o'clock, I said. I'll see you there. As I walked away, I heard him call after me. Mom, wait, we need to talk about this. But I didn't turn around. Some conversations were better had in front of witnesses, with documents and signatures, and no way to pretend the truth was anything other than what it was. Friday at 3 o'clock was going to be very interesting indeed. Thursday evening, my phone started ringing. The first call came at 6:30, just as I was finishing dinner. David's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. Mom, it's me. I think we got our wires crossed at lunch today. Can you call me back? We need to clear this up before tomorrow. The second call came at 7:15. Mom, I'm getting worried about you. Some of the things you said today, they don't make sense. I think you might be more upset about Dad's death than you're letting on. Grief can make people think things that aren't true. Please call me back. The third call came at 8:45. Mom, this is ridiculous. You're not answering your phone and now I'm really concerned. I'm coming over. I turned off my phone and went to bed early. Friday morning brought a different approach. Nora showed up at my door at 9 o'clock, carrying a bakery box and wearing her most sympathetic expression. Maggie, I brought your favorite scones from that little place downtown. David told me you two had a misunderstanding yesterday. I invited her in, curious to see what version of events David had shared with his wife. He's so worried about you, Nora continued, setting the box on my kitchen counter. He thinks the stress of Robert's death and the house sale might be affecting your judgment. My judgment about what? Well, the things you said about the house sale. David explained that you're having second thoughts, which is completely understandable. Change is scary, especially at your age. At my age, I was 52, not 92. What exactly did David tell you about our conversation? Nora perched on the edge of a kitchen chair, her posture careful and controlled. He said you've been talking to people who are filling your head with conspiracy theories about the sale. People who don't understand your financial situation or the real estate market. Conspiracy theories. He's worried that someone might be taking advantage of your grief to confuse you about what's really happening. I poured myself a cup of coffee, taking my time. And what is really happening according to David? He's trying to help you transition to a more manageable living situation. The house is too big for you now, and the maintenance costs are only going to increase as you get older. He found a buyer who's willing to take it as is, which saves you thousands in repair costs. $47,000 seems low for a house that size. Nora's smile became more strained. The market is very difficult right now. Houses in older neighborhoods aren't moving well. David researched comparable sales, and this offer is actually quite generous considering the condition issues. What condition issues? The roof, the plumbing, the electrical system. David had it inspected, and the problems are extensive. May I see the inspection report? For just a moment, Nora's composed mask slipped. David handles all the technical documents, but he explained everything to me. I'm sure he did. I sat across from her, studying the woman my son had married. She was beautiful, polished, educated. She came from money and had married into what she thought was a respectable middle-class family with a struggling but dedicated mother. She had no idea that the struggling mother was worth more than her own trust fund. "Nora, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you bought the house in the Hamptons, did you tell David's parents about it?" The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. How did you... It's a simple question. Did you tell us about the house?" She opened and closed her mouth several times before finding her voice. That's private family business." "Your family business?" "Yes." "Not David's family business?" "No, I mean yes, but it's complicated." "Is it? You inherited several $1,000,000 from your grandmother and you used some of that money to buy a vacation home. What's complicated about that?" Nora stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. David never said you knew about..." "About what?" "About the fact that while he was asking me for help with his student loans, he had access to millions of dollars? About the fact that while he was telling me I couldn't afford to maintain my house, he was buying an $800,000 vacation home with cash? That's not... We don't... That money isn't what, Nora?" She grabbed her purse, suddenly desperate to leave. "I think you should talk to David about this. There are things you don't understand." "Such as?" "Such as the fact that he's been protecting you. He could have told you about my inheritance, but he didn't want you to feel bad about your own situation. He could have stopped helping with your expenses, but he didn't want you to worry. Everything he's done has been to spare your feelings." The revelation hung in the air between us. Nora realized what she'd just admitted, that David had been lying to me for months, pretending to struggle financially while having access to vast wealth. "So the student loan payments were charity," I said quietly. "No, they were... He wanted to..." "And the requests for help with security deposits and car repairs and emergency expenses were what? Performance art?" Nora's face crumpled. "You don't understand. David loves you. He didn't want you to feel like a burden." "A burden?" "He didn't mean it that way." "How did he mean it?" She stared at me, realizing that every word she spoke was digging the hole deeper. "I have to go." "Of course you do. But Nora..." She paused at the door. "See you at the closing this afternoon." After she left, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the conversation. David hadn't just been stealing from me. He'd been performing an elaborate charade of financial struggle while secretly wealthy, taking my money not because he needed it, but because he thought I didn't deserve to keep it. The cruelty of it took my breath away. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Mom, Nora told me about your conversation. We need to talk before the closing. There are things you don't understand." I typed back, "I understand perfectly. See you at 3 o'clock. His response came immediately. "Mom, please don't do anything rash. The closing can be postponed if you're having doubts." "I'm not having doubts." "Then what's this all about?" I stared at the question for a long moment before typing my response. "It's about truth, David. Something you seem to have forgotten the value of." He didn't reply. At 2:30, I drove to Gerald Morrison's office building. The closing was scheduled for the conference room on the top floor, with a view of the entire city. I arrived early, wanting to be seated and composed when David walked in. Gerald was already there, along with a notary and a representative from the title company. The paperwork was spread across the conference table: deed transfer, purchase agreement, funding authorizations. "Are you ready for this?" Gerald asked quietly. "I've been ready for 30 years. I just didn't know it." At exactly 3 o'clock, David arrived with Nora. He looked haggard, like a man who'd spent the night trying to figure out how to explain the unexplainable. He glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on Gerald Morrison. I wasn't expecting such a formal closing for a simple family transaction. Thompson Holdings LLC takes its real estate investments very seriously, Gerald replied smoothly. "Shall we begin?" As we took our seats around the conference table, I watched David's face. He still believed he was in control of the situation. He still thought his mother was the confused widow who needed his guidance. He was about to learn otherwise. The conference room was quiet, except for the rustle of papers and the distant hum of traffic 15 floors below. David sat across from me, his lawyer's briefcase open, documents organized in neat piles. He looked confident, professional, a man handling routine business. "Before we begin," Gerald Morrison said, "I'd like to clarify the parties involved in this transaction. We have Mrs. Margaret Thompson as the seller, represented by her son, David Thompson. The buyer is Thompson Holdings, LLC. "That's correct," David said. "And Mrs. Thompson, you understand that you're selling your property at 247 Maple Street for the sum of $47,000? I nodded. "I understand completely." David relaxed slightly. His mother was being cooperative, asking no difficult questions, accepting the inevitable with the grace he'd expected. "The title search is clear," the title company representative announced. "No liens, no outstanding judgments. The property has been owned free and clear by Robert and Margaret Thompson since 1995. "Actually," Gerald interjected, "there's a small correction to make there. The property has been owned solely by Margaret Thompson since 1995. Robert Thompson was added to the deed as a courtesy, but the original purchase was made by Mrs. Thompson through a trust." David frowned. "That can't be right. My parents bought that house together." "Actually," I said quietly, "I bought the house. Your father's name was on the deed, but the money came from my inheritance." "What inheritance?" Gerald slid a document across the table. "The property was purchased with funds from the Eleanor Whitman estate, inherited by Mrs. Thompson in 1985. David picked up the document, his eyes scanning the legal language. I watched his face as he began to understand that his mother's financial situation was not what he'd believed for 30 years. This says you inherited $400,000. That was the initial value. It's grown considerably since then." "Grown how?" Gerald answered for me. "Mrs. Thompson established an investment trust with the inheritance, Thompson Holdings, LLC. The trust has been quite successful over the past 30 years. The color drained from David's face. "Thompson Holdings, LLC? "Yes," I said, "the company that's buying my house." The silence in the room was profound. David stared at me like I was a stranger, his mind racing to process the implications of what he'd just learned. You own Thompson Holdings?" "I am Thompson Holdings, the sole owner and beneficiary." Nora made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. David turned to look at her, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "That's impossible," he finally whispered. "Why is it impossible?" Because you're a nurse. You work at a hospital. You live paycheck to paycheck." "Do I?" Gerald slid another document across the table. "Current portfolio valuation for Thompson Holdings, LLC, as of yesterday's close." David looked down at the paper. The number at the bottom made him physically recoil. $2 million. His voice was barely audible. 2.3 million, actually. The market has been quite favorable for real estate investments." David stood up abruptly, his chair rolling back against the wall. "This is insane. You can't have... How long have you known?" "Known what?" "That you had money. All this time watching us struggle, letting me work extra hours to help with your expenses, taking money for Dad's medical bills." "I didn't take money, David. You offered it. And I never asked you to work extra hours. But you let me think. I let you think what you wanted to think." He began pacing the small conference room, his hands running through his hair. "This changes everything. The house sale, the low offer. If you have $2 million, why are you selling for $47,000? You tell me. You're the one who set the price." The realization hit him like a physical blow. He stopped pacing and stared at me with growing horror. "You know." "I know what?" "You know about the fake company. You know I was trying to..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Trying to what, David? I was trying to help you. By stealing my house? It wasn't stealing. You couldn't afford to maintain it. According to whom? According to your financial situation, which you apparently never understood correctly. Nora spoke for the first time since we'd sat down. David, maybe we should— Shut up, he snapped at her, then immediately looked stricken. I'm sorry, I didn't mean— This is just— Overwhelming, I suggested, finding out that the mother you thought was poor and helpless is actually wealthier than you are? Why didn't you tell me? The question was plaintive, almost childlike. For a moment, he sounded like the little boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. Would it have changed anything? Of course it would have. How? He stared at me, unable to answer, because we both knew the truth. If David had known about my money, he would have approached it differently. He would have been more direct, more demanding. He would have expected to inherit it, to control it, to benefit from it immediately. I wanted you to see me as a person, I said quietly, not as a source of money. I wanted you to value me for who I am, not what I could give you. I do value you. Do you? Then explain the house sale. He opened and closed his mouth several times, searching for words that didn't exist. I thought, I believed. You believed I was stupid. You believed I was helpless. You believed I wouldn't understand real estate values or legal documents or financial transactions. No, that's not. You created a fake company to steal my house, David. You used my own address as the business address. You planned this while your father was dying. Each word hit him like a slap. He sank back into his chair, his face gray. I wasn't stealing. I was trying to solve your problems. What problems? The house is too big for you. The maintenance costs, the utilities, the upkeep. Have I complained about any of those things? No, but have I asked for your help with any of those things? No, but I could see. You could see what? That you were struggling. I was grieving, David. There's a difference. The distinction seemed to break something inside him. He put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I don't understand, he whispered. If you have all this money, why did you let me help with Dad's medical bills? Why did you take money for my student loans? Why did you live like— Like what? Like you were poor. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and felt a deep sadness settle in my chest. Because I thought it would teach you the value of hard work. Because I thought it would help you appreciate what you earned. Because I thought it would make you a better person. And instead, it taught you that your mother was someone you could take advantage of. The silence stretched between us, filled with 30 years of misunderstandings and missed connections. Gerald Morrison cleared his throat. Shall we proceed with the closing? David looked up, his eyes red. You're really going to do this? You're really going to buy your own house? I'm going to complete the transaction you initiated. You wanted to sell my house to Thompson Holdings LLC for $47,000. Thompson Holdings LLC is prepared to honor that agreement. But now that you know I know. Now that I know you know what? He stared at me, finally understanding the trap he'd built for himself. There was no way to back out of the sale without admitting he'd been trying to defraud me. No way to explain the low price without confessing to the scheme. Sign the papers, David, I said gently. Let's finish what you started. With shaking hands, he picked up the pen. The papers were signed. The deed was transferred. The transaction was complete. David sat in his chair like a man in shock, staring at the cashier's check for $7,000 that represented my share of the sale after his fabricated debts and expenses. $7,000 for a house worth $300,000, sold to a company I owned, managed through a trust he'd never known existed. Congratulations, Gerald Morrison said, shaking my hand. Thompson Holdings LLC now officially owns 247 Maple Street. Thank you, I replied. It's been a very educational transaction. The title company representative and notary gathered their papers and left. Gerald excused himself, leaving David, Nora, and me alone in the conference room. "What happens now?" David asked, his voice hollow. "Now you go home to your $800,000 vacation house and think about what you've learned today." "And you?" "I go home to my house, the one I've always owned, that I will continue to own, that I never needed your help to afford." He looked up at me with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. "Are you going to press charges?" The question hung in the air between us. Fraud, attempted theft, elder abuse. The crimes had names and penalties. "Do you think I should?" I don't know. I don't know anything anymore." I sat down beside him, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the bewilderment of a man whose entire understanding of his world had been shattered in 30 minutes. "David, do you remember when you were 8 years old and you stole money from my purse to buy candy?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Do you remember what I told you?" "You said—" He swallowed hard. "You said that stealing from family was the worst kind of theft because it broke more than trust. It broke love. And what did you promise me? That I would never steal from you again." We sat in silence, both remembering that little boy who had cried in my arms and sworn he would always be honest with me. "You broke that promise," I said quietly. "I know. Not just the promise about stealing, the promise about honesty. I know. For months, David. While your father was dying, while I was grieving, while I needed my son to be my son, you were planning to rob me. I thought I was helping." "No." My voice was firm, but not unkind. "You thought I was stupid. You thought I was weak. You thought I deserved to be managed instead of respected." He started to protest, then stopped. There was no defense for what he'd done, no explanation that could transform theft into charity. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want you to understand what you almost lost." "The money?" "The money was never yours to lose. I'm talking about something more valuable." He looked at me with confusion. "Your mother's respect, your mother's trust, your mother's willingness to see you as the man she raised instead of the stranger you've become." Tears started forming in his eyes. "Have I lost that?" "That depends on what you do next." "What should I do?" I stood up, smoothing down my dress. "You should go home and ask yourself some difficult questions. Like why you married a woman with millions of dollars but still felt entitled to steal from your widowed mother. Like why you thought being wealthy yourself gave you the right to decide what I deserved to keep. And then? And then you should decide whether you want to be the kind of man who learns from his mistakes or the kind of man who makes excuses for them." I picked up my purse and headed for the door. "Mom, wait." I turned back. Will you ever forgive me?" The question was asked with the voice of a little boy, not a 30-year-old lawyer. It was the voice of my son, not the stranger who had tried to defraud me. "David, I forgave you the moment I realized what you were doing. Forgiveness was never the question." "Then what is the question?" "The question is whether you can forgive yourself and whether you can change." 3 months later, David called me, not to ask for money, not to explain away his actions, but to tell me he'd entered therapy. "I'm trying to understand why I did what I did," he said. "Doctor, Peterson thinks it might have something to do with feeling entitled to things I never earned." "That sounds like progress." "I told Nora about your money, about Thompson Holdings, about everything." "How did she take it?" "She was horrified, not about the money, but about what I tried to do. She said she married a man she respected, and she wanted to know where he'd gone." "Did you tell her?" "I told her I was trying to find him again." 6 months later, he asked if he could visit. Not to discuss business or money or real estate, but to see his mother. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd presented me with fraudulent sale documents, where he'd tried to convince me I couldn't afford my own life. "I've been thinking about Dad," he said. "What about him?" "About how he never knew about your money, but he never tried to control you either. He trusted you to make your own decisions. Your father understood that love means believing in someone's capability, not managing their limitations. David nodded slowly. I'm sorry I didn't learn that from him. You can still learn it. From you, from yourself, if you choose to. Today, David still visits regularly. He brings groceries sometimes, not because he thinks I can't afford them, but because he wants to do something nice for his mother. He asks about my investments occasionally, not because he wants to control them, but because he's genuinely interested in what I've accomplished. He never asks for money anymore. When I offer to help with something, a gift for his children, a contribution to a cause he cares about, he accepts it gracefully, the way you accept generosity from someone you respect. The house on Maple Street is still mine. Thompson Holdings LLC has been very satisfied with the investment. The property has appreciated considerably, though that was never really the point. Sometimes I sit in Robert's old recliner and think about the woman I used to be, the one who thought love meant sacrifice without boundaries, giving without reciprocation, enabling without accountability. That woman raised a son who thought he could steal from her and call it help. The woman I am now raised a son who learned the difference. It took 30 years and one spectacular betrayal, but Margaret Thompson finally found her voice, and her son finally learned to listen. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story touched you, please give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. Stay healthy and value yourselves.